In this episode of the Stretch Gold podcast, Scott and I are going to be talking about why the developers are always the ones to blame.
Always.
This is the Stretch Gold podcast where each week we'll share insights and lessons learned based on our experiences as entrepreneurs. We'll challenge you to create ambitious goals as you start and grow your business. I'm your host, Robert Dickerson.
I'm Scott Davis. And hey, we're trying something new today. We're actually doing a live video of our podcast so that we can then put this on YouTube. So if you want to check us out on YouTube and see our faces behind these crazy conversations that we have, we're going to be on there now. So, give us a look on the website. We'll link it up or on social media and you can find us on there.
Yeah, a little behind the scenes action of how we record, what we're doing.
That's right. And you can see me wearing a white V-neck t-shirt in most episodes. Today, I'm sorry to let you down. I did. Yeah, I did. Just for this. No.
So you were fired up about this topic of why developers are always the ones to blame. So why don't you start it off and tell us why you were so excited to do this topic today?
Well, look, this is more than just, developers are to blame, but it applies to any industry, I think, but more specifically, developers are usually the ones that are the scapegoats for a lot of these problems that software projects have, or just, products in general. More specifically, I think a lot of times what happens is when product owners or even the upper echelon of a company, especially startups, don't have their shit together, what happens is it all falls downhill. And the developers are the easy ones to blame and point the finger, when in fact, it's the rest of the company that might actually have some fault laid in their laps. And I'm not saying developers are perfect. They're not. We're people, right? But what it boils down to is that people are less accepting of developers making mistakes than others in the company. And a lot of times I think what needs to happen is that people who are at the top need to take a step back and go, what can I do to help make what the developer is doing more clear or better? And then there's a second thought to this. Let me ask you this question, Rob. Have you ever been at a company working in a developer team, maybe 7, 8 people, someone leaves, finds a new job, what happens? They become the scapegoat for every problem the next 6 months, right? Have you seen that?
Oh yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah. So you blame the person who's no longer there because it's easy. And that's the same thing that's going on up above, right? It's the same problem, which is let's put the blame on somebody else. And it's usually a software developer because they're the ones who are making the projects and missing deadlines and things like that. And that's what happens. And yeah, I'm fired up about it because it happens all the time. And, it's something that impacts us and what we do.
I mean, I've never met a developer that thought somebody else's code was good or didn't have problems. So
that's very true.
So, people always try to blame other people. Why don't we talk a little bit first about, kind of some of the problems we see and why people are blamed, and then talk about, what are some ways that people can go about fixing that?
Sure. Yeah, that's great.
I think unrealistic schedules is one of the biggest things that I've seen when under development is that people have a set budget or a set time. They want something done. They have a certain amount of features. And so everyone agrees and starts off, but then there's always feature creep or, people go on vacation or something comes up and they didn't manage the schedule properly. And so things fall behind. And so then it gets blamed on the developers for not completing their work in the right amount of time. Maybe there was some dependency there that, if we're working together, you need to complete something first before I can get started. And so I start blaming you. Yeah. So this blocker, and there's this blaming culture created because we're arguing. And a lot of times these companies are built around small teams. Even some of the larger companies build around small teams. So there's not that many people that, you can really hold accountable to get stuff done.
Yeah. And, you're definitely right. I think probably the biggest contributors, number one is scope creep. And number two is not defining feature sets. So, you've seen it a million times. You're working with a startup or you're working with a customer and you agree, maybe not to a statement of work, but you agree to some set of features that are going to be production ready by a certain date. And what happens is you get most of those features ready. They start testing it. And then they come up with new ideas or new features which weren't agreed to originally. And then you start adding those because you're a developer and you want to help and you believe in the product. And the next thing you know, you've missed a deadline, right? So that happens a lot. And there's other scenarios where your team just isn't good enough, and perhaps you just aren't technically ready. But scope creep is huge, and then not defining exactly what is needed. So a vague feature, for example, maybe I need to submit my location so others can see it. Okay, well, that's really open-ended. Where is your location being sent to? Under what parameters is that location being obtained? Is it every second, every time you move, every hour? You know, what format is it going to be in? All those things have to be defined before a developer can begin working on it. Because when the developer starts, if they're spending their time figuring out those parameters, they're not developing software, and now you're behind schedule.
I mean, part of that, and maybe the majority of that, is a management issue.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, a job as a manager is to basically create those schedules and create realistic expectations and remove blockers from your team so that they can get the work done. And if you're not managing properly, then all these different things can happen. And even as an entrepreneur, as a leader of your company, you're going to be the one looked to remove these blockers, to set the scope, to set the schedules. And so if you don't provide consistent, clear communication to your development team of what you want them to do, if you're changing your mind every day, I mean, that's going to cause scope creep. That's going to cause them to, you know, fall behind on the features that they were trying to get done. So you really need to make sure you provide clear communication, clear goals, clear expectations, and then you get buy-in from the team, that you get their feedback, whether this is a reasonable expectation or not, that they can get it done. That's something that I always do when I work with other developers, is I have in my mind how long I think it should take, and I lay that out for them. And I get their feedback is, do they agree? Do they not agree? And that can often be really enlightening, because they'll tell you, oh, well, what about this, this, and this? Maybe things you didn't think of that you could include in. And sometimes you can't always include all that stuff in your schedule, but then you can maybe cut back on the features some in order to fit it within the time frame and the budget you're looking at.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes scope creep isn't necessarily the customer adding new features, but maybe changing the way that the feature works. So it may not be, oh, add 5 new buttons, which is scope creep. It might be, well, you know, can we change this to look a little bit different, and change this font, and update this color, and remove the drop shadow over here. All those things, that's additional work, right? That doesn't come free. It requires time. And all of those things add up, is basically what I was getting to. But I like your approach. It's you know, hey guys, here's my expectation of how long this is going to take. Do you agree? But the problem is, and this happened, I have some real world experience with this recently, is not all people can deliver on those expectations. If they say, oh yeah, we'll have this done today, we'll have this done tomorrow, and then you communicate to your contact, superior, whatever, that yes, it's going to be done today or tomorrow, and then they don't deliver, now you're left with your pants down. So how do you deal with that scenario?
Well, we've talked about this in in a couple episodes, actually, is that you need to build in that time, that buffer time. If someone tells you 2 weeks, you don't say 2 weeks to a customer. I mean, you give yourself a month, right?
Yeah.
And really a lot of that comes from experience and just doing it, understanding how long the design process takes. Because if a developer tells me 2 weeks, does that include testing? Does that include
usually
launching it? No, it's probably takes them 2 weeks to write the feature.
Right.
So it depends on how you're writing your code. Are you building in the test as you go? Are you getting feedback from customers as you go? Because you have to build in time to refine your design. I mean, we all have our internal ideas of things that we want to do, but after you launch the feature, after you start using the feature, you find things to tweak, you find feedback that you need to incorporate into the design. So those kind of things always have to be involved. And so with experience, I think you get better at this. And probably the first couple of times you're going to crash and burn, and you're going to be late with features. But give yourself a buffer, and try to use that to launch your features and your new products.
Sure. And one thing that's hard to do, too, is if, let's say you're the lead developer on a project and or an architect or something, and you're spending your time in meetings or trying to communicate things to people within the organization, that's time away from the code that you don't necessarily account for. You assume that you're going to work 8 hours a day. I've seen these studies where it suggests that most developers might get in 4 to 5 hours of code a day for a typical 8-hour workday. So the assumption isn't, it's going to take me 2 days at 8 hours a day. If you're thinking that's 16 hours, that's probably 4 days of work when you break it down due to email distractions, meetings, communicating with business owners and things like that. So again, it all comes back to the developer, and it's easy for the developer to be the scapegoat. And I think really what needs to happen is just maybe developers need to stand up a little bit and say, whoa, and push back and say, look, you've not given me what I need to complete this job. And I think that will help, especially for freelancers. You see a lot of freelancers fall flat on their face and miss deadlines all the time. And that's because, generally speaking, there's a lot of scope creep and probably not enough time dedicated from the developer's perspective. There's the nature of freelancing, but I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think the important thing is that you do that at the front end, not at the back end. So don't wait till the last day to say, oh, I can't get this done. You need to be transparent at the beginning. And as a manager, you need to be receptive of that feedback. Mm-hmm. So that somebody tells you if you adjust your schedule to take 3 weeks, you need to hold people accountable for that. And that's another thing I see so often, that there's, especially in large companies, there's no accountability for those deadlines of what people signed up for. And I think as a developer, if you're going to tell someone that you're going to take so much time, you need to meet that expectation and get the work done in that period of time. And if you don't think you can, you need to tell people up front. You also need to be transparent about it during the process, that, if things are going to take longer, let people know as soon as you can so the schedule can be adjusted. And by giving people that accountability and that they're understanding to meet those deadlines, you can kind of create a better team to get things done.
Sure. One thing that is a bit frustrating, though, let's say you've got a project perfectly laid out. You've got all the details you need. In my head, I see a project, visually. I know how I'm going to attack it, how I'm going to architect it. I almost see the code and the solution in my head. And if you start changing priorities and the orders at which things are supposed to be worked on based on your subjective opinion, that affects my architecture and how I'm going to develop something. And I don't know if that's the case with all developers, but it definitely is for me. So when you start switching things around in terms of priorities and, well, we really need this feature done first. Well, what if that feature has, necessities that are upstream, prerequisites? So there's a little bit of that too, that I think product owners need to maybe understand, is that when you shift priorities, you need to communicate downstream to your developers and make sure that there are no large impacts to what they're doing.
I mean, communication is the single biggest flaw I see in every company. And it goes not only to developers, but management, but from executives, it's everywhere. I mean, it's the thing that you need to improve most within your company. And it's just so critical that you communicate your expectations and that people communicate what they're working on. I mean, there's a million tools out there for doing this, but still we struggle with communicating with one another to figure some of these things out. So that has got to be the number one priority, especially if you're leading a company, that you open the lines of communication and that you are crystal clear about what you want people to do. And a lot of times I find that you need to do that in writing. You need to write down what you want people to do, because if you and I sit here and talk about something, you're going to take something different away than what I told you, right? So you need to get it down in writing. And that's a way that, we can both agree on something.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and even still though, things change and it's hard. And, that's a one-way street though. A lot of times you hold a developer to a deadline, but there's usually no protection to the developer for scope creep and things like that. So as a developer, as a freelancer or whatever, or company, you need to protect yourself from that. You put it in your contracts. Like, this is based on these features definitively. Any change to these features results in, additional time and blah, 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 blah.
I mean, that's why I don't like fixed price contracts, right? Because, if I'm charging you by the hour and you change your mind and want to do this other feature, fine, we'll do it, right? It's just going to cost more money and time. So, if you can get away with that, then it's usually better off in the long term.
Right. Yeah. So the other piece of it that I mentioned was the whole a developer leaves, right? And the developer immediately becomes the target of attack from other developers on the team, right? They become the scapegoat for the problems for the next 3 to 6 months. They're the easy excuse for why things can't be done or why things need to be refactored. That happens all the time.
Yeah, I mean, small teams, it's just hard with a small team, right? Because everyone has their specific area that they're working on, that they're building, and there's not a lot of overlap in small teams, right? And so
Yeah.
as you're starting your company, you're going to have just enough funding to kind of get each of these individual people to do their own piece to the puzzle. And so you can't have two people working on it and kind of like sharing the responsibility. And so when one person leaves out of that team, that's a huge chunk taken away from what people were working on. And so to blame them, I mean, there's got to be agreement on the solution and what that person's doing. I mean, if someone leaves, there shouldn't just be this big thing of what was that person working on? I never looked at their code. There's got to be that collaborative approach. You got to build it in, whether it's, I in my corporate jobs, I was trying to get people to do reviews all the time, right? So that people could have discussions over what they were doing, and we weren't just working in these silos alone. So that if someone left or if you have to go work on their code, other people would know, how to build a product and what they were working on.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think too, if you have, it kind of puts it back in the developer's lap if you have code reviews and things like that. If a developer's like, well, Steve left and, he didn't write this that well. Well, guess what? Didn't you review his code? Didn't you say everything was cool? Okay, well, guess what? You got to deal with it,
Right.
But so, I mean, I just think it's funny. Like I've seen this my whole life. A developer leaves the team and it's basically becomes like a bunch of piranha attacking that developer in their absence. If they had a little ghost over there in their chair, they'd be like mauled to pieces. So it's just, it's the reality. That's just what happens. And it's kind of upsetting because, most likely you've worked with them and you've not said anything about their code to them. You're just like, oh yeah, hey, good job on that feature, but then when they leave, you're like, jerk, you had horrible code, I mean, developers don't make it any better, right? Like you said, most developers are elitists, which is my code is the greatest code that was ever written by anyone at any time and always will be. And the reality is most of us probably don't really write the most beautiful code. We write the way that we think will resolve the problem. And so, yeah, I don't know, but it's always frustrated me about that in the tech space is that developers turn on each other very quickly. And
well, I mean, developers like to think from the ground up, right? They want to develop the solution themselves. I mean, that's part of the fun of it is creating something from scratch. I mean, I'm very similar to you as I can see solutions in my head and I know how I want to work them. And when you already have somebody else that wrote some code, now you got to go around that. You got to integrate with that. So your solution isn't as clean in your head as you want it to be. So that can frustrate people, right? Because you have constraints that now you have to work within. I mean, that's why we see all these different libraries and people trying to reinvent the same thing over and over again to make it better because they want to start from scratch. They want to build it up.
Well, code's always evolving, right? It's always changing and it always will. It kind of has to. Technologies change, platforms change, all that good stuff. And then things get deprecated and things get updated and now you've got new features and things that make more efficient. And so, yeah, it's always evolving and every time you almost have to look at your algorithms and restructure them completely. But, it's just, I think developers need to be a little bit more, less elitist and more like collaborative, I think, and you'll get a better experience. But my biggest frustration though, really is just, I've seen it a lot over my career and it's very easy to blame a developer. And then sometimes there's unforeseen items that impact those timelines, difficulties or architecture changes that maybe increase the estimated time to complete things. But you're absolutely right. It comes back down to communication and that's something we can all do better at.
Yeah. So why don't we talk for a couple minutes about, how do you fix those things? I think we've talked about a couple of the issues. I mean, one is communication. It's like, maybe try to refine the processes that you use to communicate with your teams. That doesn't necessarily mean have more meetings. I mean, it can mean maybe having a daily stand-up or a weekly stand-up or something to talk through issues, talk through problems. So figure out how you can communicate in writing, what works best with your team. I mean, there's different tools, different teams work different ways. So figure out what the best form of communication is, and also how you can solicit feedback from your team to make sure that those expectations that you set are reasonable, and that people can be held accountable for, what they're buying into when they become part of your team.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
The other things that I kind of noted here was, along with communication, is don't throw stuff over the wall. I see this a lot of times too, where people will come up with something, and especially if they're not familiar with the development process, they'll come up with an idea or a concept, and they'll throw it to the development team, and the development team will say, okay, we'll have this done in a month. And so there's no communication for a month, and the person expects it to be done. They just kind of threw it over the wall. That never works. You need to be involved. Even if you're not a developer yourself, if you're running an organization, you need to be involved and really get feedback on a daily basis of what's going on to make sure that you can kind of direct people and direct the flow of what they're trying to do.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that.
Other things, I talked a little bit about laying expectations and communicate. When you're talking about communications, that's definitely a big one. Getting involved in all the steps. And I guess the final thing is, we talked about building in the buffers into your schedule, and that really comes with experience. So the more you do this, the more you work at it, the better you'll get, and you'll understand kind of the variables that are at play. And as you get to know your team better as well, you'll get better at it. And maybe go ahead.
Sorry, there's a fundamental flaw in that, though, especially if you work in the startup space, and that's you never have enough time, and they want it fast. And so, if you say this is going to take 3 weeks, they're going to say, nah, you've got 7 days. Okay, well, so it doesn't necessarily work, right? And that's a cyclical and very degenerative problem in the startup space, is that you've got to get things done quickly. A lot of times you have to cut corners to do that. What ends up happening is that creates bugs, that creates problems, that creates scalability issues, which is why companies like Snapchat then have to raise $200 million to scale the product, because they wrote it poorly in the first place. So, I mean, you see that's an open-ended door. It happens all the time. But by not allowing developers to take enough time to build a product, you create problems for yourself down the line. And a lot of founders, no, we just need the feature. Give me the feature as quickly as possible. But what you don't realize is you have to think about the bigger picture.
Well, I think you need to not be afraid to push back sometimes too. And I think with experience, you understand the limitations. Maybe you understand the underlying problem that they're trying to solve, right? They're trying to work all these features to solve this problem. Or how do we actually solve that problem? Do we really need all these different components, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we can do just 2 of these instead of 10 of these, right? To get to that solution that you really want to solve, whether it's, I want to make my onboarding process better, or I need this key feature for a customer. You need to really try to identify what the underlying problem is and push back and make sure that you're not building a bunch of things that you don't really need to solve that problem. Yeah,
absolutely. And that, like you said, that comes with experience, but it also comes with communication. And, you have to be able to communicate like, hey, look, I understand what you want, but what I'm telling you is that here's the downsides to going with that approach. Do you agree with those risks? Okay. All right. I've warned you, but yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And really what it boils down to is, like I said, is that oftentimes developers can be the easy target when things aren't achieved because they're the ones creating the products. But sometimes there are things that aren't controllable by anybody in the team that can cause those delays. But then other times it's directly a result of communication from upstream and also feature and scope creep.
I agree.
Cool.
So I guess let us know if have you been the blamed developer? What was the reason? Hit us up on Twitter and let us know.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear it.
Give us a shout on SoundCloud and iTunes, and let us know what you want to hear about next.
And come check us out on YouTube. Check out this video and see what you think.
See ya.
See you next week.